Okay, I think we're all just about here. So welcome everyone to this webinar. For those who have joined us previously, welcome back. And for those who are here for the first time, thanks for coming along. We're delighted today to have Dr. Nicole Miranda from University of Oxford speaking on future of cooling. Dr. Miranda is Programme Manager for the Oxford Martins Future of Cooling Programme. Her main research focuses on passive cooling systems, those that consume no or very low energy, especially compared to air conditioners. With a background in chemical engineering and sustainable energy systems, she considers technological solutions for mitigating building energy consumption while providing thermal comfort. Her research forms part of the wide portfolio of both the Oxford Martins School and the Energy and Power Group in the engineering department. So Nicole's going to speak for about 40 minutes. If you have any questions, do put them in the chat, and if they're relevant, or we'll also have time for questions at the end. Just a quick note, we are recording this. If you don't want to say anything or you have concerns at the end, just email us if you want us to cut anything out, because we're planning to hopefully put this up on YouTube. So yeah, without further ado, I'll pass over to Nicole.
Thanks, Matt. I can't see the chat at the moment, so please read out the questions if they come. And
Will do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction and for having me here today. So this presentation is going to, well, here's the title, Future of Cooling and its Links to Sustainable Development Goals. And it's based on a paper that we published at the end of last year with the whole team of the Future of Cooling program. So that's us there. And so for further reference, I've left the author's link there, so you can, I can share these slides and you can access the paper. So following that structure, we're going to cover 6 topics. The first is looking at the challenges around cooling, why we need to look at cooling, both in research and in practice. The second is cooling and the Sustainable Development Goals, so how we've linked them. The third is a proposition of our team, an analytical framework to look at cooling and all its very different challenges, and to kind of decompose the challenges and identify intervention points that can take cooling to a sustainable future. And then we'll go through some exemplary intervention points, followed by an agenda that we're proposing, and our program and team I'll introduce at the end, so you know who to contact. So let's start with point 1. Why cooling? So cooling has been described as an agent of modernity. So civilizations have advanced thanks to being able to adapt to really hot weather. However, today the lack of cooling poses a risk. In fact, there's 1.1 billion people at risk, and this is health, but also life risk from the lack of access to cooling. Just to give you some statistics, there's predictions from IEA that 10 air conditioners will be sold every second for the next 30 years. So that's an enormous amount. It will take our current stack of air conditioners from 1.6 billion up to 5.6 billion in 2050. And with this comes an enormous amount of energy demand. By 2050, it's predicted to be the energy required for just air conditioners, if we follow the current path, will be equivalent to all the energy that today is used by the US, Europe, and Japan. So it will stress so much our energy systems, and we need to prepare. And if we look at predictions further beyond 2050, we have this kind of forecast, and you can see that air conditioning energy is going to surpass heating, mainly due to climate change. We'll look at the macro drivers that are pushing this curve upwards later, but it's climate change and global temperatures rising, but it's also to do with income increase in especially in tropical countries. So as you can see, we're just at the start of this S-shaped curve. And the biggest challenge is that we are predicted to go up this curve just using these air conditioners. And air conditioners until now have provided thermal comfort to millions in the world. But there's a big risk of getting locked into a single technology. Air conditioners use refrigerants that have a huge global warming potential, and they use energy. And I interviewed another expert on these systems, and she said, we as engineers and architects are very well trained to solve problems. So we will go and buy an air conditioner because that will solve the problem. But how can we avoid the problem from the beginning is something that at times is out of our scope, right? So, and in avoiding the air conditioners, we get lots of other technologies like technologies and behaviors, so passive technologies. So looking at all these chilling prospects, the challenges, we've identified 2 gaps, and this is what we are covering in the paper and in today's presentation. First of all, is there, and what is the extent of the relationship between cooling and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Because of cooling being such a huge problem, a huge challenge, how is it going to affect the achievement of these goals? And second of all, we observe that the literature in general doesn't have a holistic approach. So it's siloed at the moment. You can see you can see lots of literature on air conditioners and how to make them more efficient, or on design of buildings and on behaviors, but how to look at this all together. And so we address these 2 gaps by doing a systematic review of the literature that specifically to link cooling and all the SDGs, develop an analytical framework. This is the holistic approach that I'm talking about, and also propose interventions that could start steering the way. Because one of the different things of our program is we're not only here to understand, but we also want to shape. So we want to propose solutions. So just another gap I wanted to talk about is that in the SDGs that we did a bit of a pre-work and looked at if there's any word such as cooling, cool, cold, refrigeration in there, and we couldn't find any. So it just points out the gap a bit more more explicitly. And also we did the same exercise with the UK emission targets, and cooling is just mentioned as an annex to heating. So, which is understandable because historically the UK has needed more heating, but with increased heat waves, we will need to think about cooling. So cooling and the SDGs, the second point in the agenda. We did some preliminary work, so this is not published, by looking at all the targets. So each of the goals have several targets, as you are aware, and we did expert elicitation method, so a brainstorm between all of the members of the team to see if we could think of links between cooling, and if it had an effect, it could be a positive or a negative effect over the specific targets. And in red, you can see what we thought. So I'm saying this, it comes from us. It's not published and it's not obviously a systematic review yet. But as you can see from this initial assessment, we did identify that there was links in everywhere. So then we thought, okay, there is potential here. Let's go and see what is the evidence saying. And so then we went into the literature with a systematic review. we chose common words for cooling, such as the ones in this block. And we did 17 searches, one for each sustainable development goal. Okay, so just as an example here, you can see the words that we used for Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is the access to clean and affordable energy, which I think is of interest to this public. We did this search on Web of Science because it has more than 12,000 journals and it's different disciplines. And it was a topic search. So that means that all these words in the 17 searches were looked at the titles, the abstracts, and the keywords. And from this, we found about 5 million papers that would cover all the themes. That would cover all the SDGs. And from the 5 million papers, 0.43% of the articles also covered cooling. So only 0.43% would be a subgroup of the SDG papers that covered cooling. And now if we look at each SDG, you can see, first of all, that blue bars indicate the number of papers that we found related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in orange is the subgroup per SDG that is related to cooling. So it's a subgroup. And look at this scale here. It's a logarithmic scale. So these are orders of magnitude, enormous orders of magnitude difference. We can see that the most related ones, most related SDGs to cooling are only 1.5 order of magnitude difference. And that's for SDG 7, as expected because of the projections of energy demand from cooling. And SDG 12. SDG 12 is called Responsible Production and Consumption. And it links to cooling, as we'll see a little later, in respect to the production of air conditioners, doing it in a responsible way. So for example, with proper disposal of refrigerants at the end of the life, but also there's a link through food because the cooling through cold chains and refrigeration can preserve food. So there is a responsible production and consumption of food linked to cooling. So the ones that were least related that we could find were SDG 4, this one here. So the ratio between the blue and the orange bars are quite big, and that has to do with quality education. So SDG 4, but regardless of it being the least related, we still found links. I'll go through those links in a little bit. And then SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goals, was also least related to cooling. At least that's the academic literature that we could identify. So then I'm going to dive a bit deeper into some of the SDGs to provide you examples of those links between cooling and the SDGs. So let's start with SDG 2, Zero Hunger. Specifically, that links to cooling because of the delivery and production of food. So cooling is needed throughout a cold chain, so throughout between the food leaving the production center to the supermarket and even further in our houses and in our refrigerators. But also there's cooling needed for greenhouses and aquaponic systems. So it's further than cold chains only. In SDG 3, good health and well-being. So cooling can mitigate the burden of severe exposure to heat in different countries. Now, this also has to do with the demographics, because if a country has an older population, then they're more vulnerable to heat exposure, of course. But so cooling can be an intervention to lessen those risks. As we said before, there's 1.1 billion people currently at risk. in terms of quality education, so we said that this one was one of the least related, but we found research that suggested that cognitive faculties are impaired by extreme temperatures, together with productivity and learning outcomes. So cooling can have a positive effect on education, if or the lack of cooling, vice versa, could impair pupils. SDG 5, so that's one that we hadn't identified much before in our preliminary work, but we ran into studies that looked at how often women are in charge of household and food related activities. And by having cooling and refrigeration, it had enabled them to undertake smaller businesses. So they could preserve their food and not worry so much about the cooking and those roles that are in certain societies, and could use the same refrigerator to sell food, for example. SDG 6, this is clean water and sanitation. And we found that link with cooling in industry, actually. So often industry uses vast amounts of water to cool their processes. And this, unfortunately, competes with water available for sanitation in the regions. SDG 7, we've talked about, it's a huge energy demand from cooling, and that would start to compete with other services and products that need energy. But it also is vice versa. There's certain energy systems that require cooling. For example, solar concentration. Sometimes those salts that are used peak, they have temperatures that are too high, so they have to be reduced by some system of cooling. I'll jump to SDG 12, responsible consumption and responsible consumption and production. So as we said before, it's very related to the food. The example is cold chains. So we should produce and consume food in a responsible way, but also there's the whole cooling in itself needs to be consumed and produced sustainably. And finally, I'm going to touch on SDG 13, which is climate action. And this is something that has more to do with those F gases, those refrigerants. So how do we link cooling with action needed to take, action needed? And one good example there is the Kigali Amendment. So that's specifically an amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase out refrigerants so that there's less leaks and less greenhouse gas emissions from air conditioning technology. And heat pumps as well. Heat pumps also use refrigerants. So those are some examples, but if you go to our paper, or we could look at more examples of the links at the end if you have questions. So we've got all these links with the SDGs that we identified in the literature. And now how do we organize them in a way that we can intervene and we can identify intervention points? So that's where our analytical framework comes in. And what we're trying to answer here is how can the solution space be, how can the solution space for transitioning cooling towards sustainable development be identified? Okay, that's the main research question. You may know about other frameworks that and be thinking, oh, why don't they apply a different one that already exists? So just to name a few, the multi-level and the system innovations frameworks, they're very focused on technology and how a new innovation breaks into the market and can and navigates through it. You've probably seen that beautiful graphics around the multi-level approach. So we don't take the vision of one particular technology. We want to go beyond that and see, for example, a particular behavior, but also a particular policy around cooling. So that's why we need to add more to that one. There's frameworks such as a transition management framework that looks more on the governance side. So then we're leaving the technology and so on. There's the energy cultures, which perhaps is more micro, and you can't see completely markets and institution. So we wanted to bring all that together, and this is how we did it. We first identified the macro drivers. These are external influencers to the cooling demand system, but it's not vice versa. Cooling wouldn't affect them exactly. So in the socioeconomic side, we've got energy prices, increased income, urbanization, population growth is going to increase the demand for cooling. Technology is an interesting one because at the moment we're all probably very aware of the COVID vaccines, and some of them need minus 70 degrees Celsius and others and another minus 20 degrees Celsius. So you can see that technology sometimes require cooling. The most traditional example is the data centers, and as those technologies grow, more cooling will be required. Environmental one is, I consider, the most clear macro driver, because as climate change progresses, so will temperatures. Temperatures will increase, and that will derive in more cooling demand. And then geopolitical drivers, those are the most macro governance drivers. And of course, they look at how countries and private sectors develop cooling, not only the technology side, but also policy. So having these macro drivers, we then said, let's define the cooling system. And initially we look at stages of cooling. This resembles a life cycle, as you can see, but I'll run you through how we've defined it specifically for cooling. So resources, we consider extraction of materials. Production and assemblage is combining those materials for a passive or active cooling technology. This includes up to deployment of the technology. Cooling activities is the most multifaceted one, because it includes purchasing, operating, and maintaining the technology, but that's where lots of the end user, the people interaction comes into place too. And then end of life, just like a life cycle, it would be removal, decommission, and it can include recycling, upcycling. So it could link back into the resource side. So I'll give you an example of an active system and a passive system now that run through these stages of cooling before continuing with the framework presentation. For an active cooling system, this is a district cooling system. So you have centralized active technology such as chillers or absorption cooling or air conditioners, and they provide district cooling to different households here. Resources would be anything you need to produce those chillers, those pipes, so plastic, and then also a resource would be the fluid that you're going to circulate through those pipes. Production and assemblage is kind of the civil works of installing that, digging the ground or retrofitting into the buildings. The cooling activity is, in this case, the operation and maintenance is centralized, but you also have an interface with the user, which could very much affect those cooling activities. For example, putting the thermostat in a different position. And at the end of this setup, there'll come a decommissioning, and it may or may not match the end of life of those buildings. So an example of a passive technology, this is a completely different side, would be the use of plants. And For plants, you need to orient them in the right place, because that will optimize for shade. So resources are very different here. You can see seeds, cutting, soils, nutrients, and water. Production and assemblage is what I was saying, putting them in the right location. And then the cooling activities, maintenance for this is so different than for like a sturdy technology, right? It's pruning or watering. And end of life, of course, is taking, when it's necessary, taking this out and perhaps giving it a sustainable end, such as sending it as biomass for heating. So those are just two very, very different examples of active and passive technology. And going back to our framework now, after we identified these stages of cooling, we said, okay, what can change these? What are the levers that we have to make changes and interventions in these stages? And we identified 5. So in social interactions, it includes everything to do with behaviors that can shape the technology adoption. For example, there might be very pro-environmental choices done, or there could be a status thing. Like, I'll show you an example. This person in the Amazon, my colleague Antonella took this picture. You can see that the house isn't in great shape, but they have an air conditioner there. And as a background, this person and this community gave status to having an air conditioner. So it's a behavior that unfortunately gets the adoption of this kind of technology, because we then figured out it was a secondhand air conditioner. So it doesn't have the best efficiency, and it probably was sold on a black market. So there's lots of negative connotations around adopting it, but for the end user, it gives them the status. So it's a behavioral example. Then on the technological lever, each one of these stages can have innovation. And so the most studied ones are around the production and assemblage, so how to make active cooling more efficient, but also for passive cooling, where do we find materials such as phase-changing materials that are cheaper and can be applied more extensively. In business models, we look at how firms put forward a value proposition around cooling. And again, they could affect several of these stages of cooling, or one of them. It really depends on that value proposition of a business. The governance lever is a more macro one, and it includes aligning all or different actors in the cooling landscape, steering the direction, and including instruments of policy. For example, it could include bringing new performance standards, or adopting national and international agreements. And finally, infrastructure design, we considered as a separate lever. This is referring not only to the physical built environment, but also the soft infrastructure. So what skills are around in an area, and how both of those, the hard and the soft infrastructure, can limit or impulse these stages. So for example, in a city, if it's quite densely populated, district cooling might not be a good option, because retrofitting and digging in is a major event, and maybe in a more rural area or less dense, it would be a bit better for the digging part of the process. So installation of that infrastructure. And when we cross over all these levers of change with the stages of cooling, we find 20 intervention points So these are the intervention points we've identified. And in the next part of the presentation, I will give you examples of interventions that we are looking at that we consider could support cooling to transition to a more sustainable future. So the first intervention point is cooling as a service. So this is a business model, and that's why it is in this column. And it may affect, well, it's mainly based on cooling activities, but it also may affect production and assemblage. And let me go a little bit deeper on that. So the value proposition of this business model is to make sustainable and more environmentally friendly cooling broadly available. The basic principle is that a company retains the ownership of the assets. So for example, this on top of a building, on a roof, there you can see the air conditioners, and one company would be owning this. And the end user then only pay as if it was pay as you go for the cooling provision. This has environmentally positive things because it is in the company's interest to have more efficient technology and maintain it properly so that the life cycle of that technology can be extended and it can perform well. At the same time, the end user, because they are paying for the operation or for the pay-as-you-go, as I've said, they don't have to pay for capital expenditures for the installation. So that's quite a positive thing. And this business model has cases, study cases all around the world already. It's really picking up, and we haven't seen alternatives to it. We're looking into it, but for now, it is offering a really good value proposition. The second intervention point that we're looking into is embedding passive and energy efficiency cooling in cities. Cities is where cooling demand will surge because there's a higher population there. We also get the heat island effects there. So it's important to start planning from now on, because passive cooling have a very long lifespan. It could be really embedded into buildings. So for example, shading and vegetation around, or glazing of windows there, and ventilation systems, natural ventilation systems, all things that need to be started from this design of buildings. And on that front, they may last longer than the active systems, because active systems have moving parts, so electromechanical components, and so they are more prone to fail because they have those parts. So this image here from Singapore is a really lovely example of just an amazing green park that they've done in the middle of their city. And but I did want to raise that there is issues, and we've looked at a cooling plan of New York City, and the challenges that they raised were that it needs enormous amount of coordination and kind of a same view, a same vision of how the city is going to look. So professionals, like from architects to engineers to organizations with high cooling demand, and individuals really need to put all their efforts together, their vision, unify their vision. Another intervention point that we've identified is to the global phase down of F gases. And we put this in the governance column because of the Kigali amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So that has set targets. And just to give you some scary statistics, there is predictions that if we don't phase refrigerants out by 2050, 20% of greenhouse gas emissions might be due to these HFCs and CFCs. Just for a little bit of history, the Montreal Protocol, when it was signed in the 80s, it was focusing on the ozone depletion, so the hole in the ozone that we have. But today, that has been, or it's in a good way being solved, and or there's being improvements. I'd like to say better. But today the Kigali Amendment on the Montreal Protocol has shifted to talk more about those greenhouse gas emissions, the global warming potential of those refrigerants that, as you can see here, is sometimes 10,000 times worse than CO2. So, and then the final intervention point that we think is fit to reach sustainable cooling is understanding the role of lifestyle and behaviors. So my colleague again here drew a wonderful figure with all the options that this person has, and that the options and choices will be influenced by the lifestyle of that person, their habits, social-cultural, psychological factors. A great example of this is when we compare the US to Japan. So the US and Japan both have 90% of their households with air conditioners. However, the consumption of energy for cooling in the US is 6 times more per capita to Europe, 20 times more compared to India. And these figures are not repeated in Japan. In Japan, cooling is air conditioner use is the last resource. First, they prefer ventilation, opening the windows. There's even been movements around changing outfits for work. So people don't have to wear their full suits for work, and they can wear a badge that says I'm pro cooling, sustainable cooling, and so they don't have to wear. So you can see the difference in lifestyles, and that's something that we really need to understand to harvest the good things around cooling, the socioeconomic and psychological factors. So finally, we have summarized 3 overarching outcome-oriented themes to set an agenda for cooling. The first is planetary stewardship. So the motivation around here is that we need to break the cycle of global warming will increase temperatures, which will increase cooling consumption, air conditioner consumption. Air conditioners will increase energy consumption will increase greenhouse gas emissions, and then we go again with this cycle. So we need to break this cycle, because if we don't, then we're not balancing human needs with the planet resources. The second is that we do need to be more aware of the demand of cooling in different geographies. So it's not going to only affect the tropics. It's going to come, well, and it is coming more and more to countries that are traditionally unprepared for heat waves, like the UK, the infrastructure, and people are more prepared for heat than for cooling. Finally, we need to think in long-term solutions. First, before going and buying an air conditioner off the shelf, we need to think of passive cooling system. There's going to be a point where passive might not achieve thermal comfort because temperatures are going to be too high, but we need to think of how to mitigate the use of active cooling. So those are the 3. And finally, I just want to do a short introduction to our team and program. That is our team. Radhika and Malcolm are our PIs, and we are very multidisciplinary. We've got engineers background, geography, Francois here is an economist, primary health care. So looking at that side of morbidity and mortality around the lack of cooling is also included. So, and just a final thing to say is that our program isn't only understanding, it's shaping. And if you can help us shape that future of cooling, do please get in touch. There's my information, and thank you. Hope I didn't put you to sleep like this lady under a big cooling book.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. That's been super interesting. I really like this last point where you had this sort of feedback loop of cooling makes the planet warmer over a sort of super long time scale. So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand or put them in the chat and I'll read them out. As chair, I'll take the advantage to ask the first question, I guess, while people are thinking. Interesting to hear about the expert elicitation that you were talking about right at the beginning. I was wondering how that sort of went and whether you think that was that the right way to do it, the expert elicitation first, and then you sort of did this lit review afterwards? Because I've heard mixed reviews of expert elicitation. Sometimes it's super interesting and it works really well, and other times maybe you don't get the right questions or you don't have the right people. So I was curious how that whole process went, I guess.
Yeah, so I think it was kind of a formal way of doing a brainstorming activity, because it was in a structured way. We followed those targets, but in terms of, we didn't want to put it into our paper because of reproducibility of it, and we wanted to really nail the examples. So this is one example of the link for each goal rather than each target. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely something that I would recommend. It's I've seen published work with expert elicitation methods as well, so they are out there, and it's a very handy tool. For our preliminary work, it really gave us the confidence. Okay, there must be something out there because we're just getting into cooling. This was at the beginning of the program, and we can see all these links. So let's go. It gave us the momentum to go into the literature and find the actual evidence. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense. And were the experts mostly people central to Oxford, or did you sort of manage to get a nice broad?
Central to Oxford, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of, it was interesting you were talking about cooling as a service. That seems to be quite a popular thing at the moment. Where do you see that? Because obviously, I suppose the good thing about cooling, as you say, the naturally really good thing is that you don't have to have this massive capex, and so you can just sort of get this company. But I guess the downside is that installation of cooling systems, I guess, is probably actually quite expensive, and so it's not like you can just come and, or maybe it's not, I don't know, can you just come and put an aircon on someone's house for a year or two and then they decide they don't want it and you ship it off somewhere else quite easily?
Yeah.
Is that sort of how it works, or?
That's absolutely a risk what you're saying. So there's not much academic literature on this topic, and we're looking into it now with the creators of the business model, which is based, but not UK based, it's Swiss based. So we're looking into case studies to see that interaction of if the end user doesn't want to use it anymore. But there is contractual setups to protect the company too. So hopefully it'll take off. We're looking into seeing, is there alternatives? Because this is the first case study, the first business model that is super aligned with cooling, like in terms of providing cooling as a service rather than the asset selling the air conditioner. So yeah, we're very curious if there's alternatives, if they're going to start coming up. But for now, it is the option out there. I just wanted to say that cooling as a service is different than district cooling. They usually are mentioned together or compared to each other. And district cooling has more to do with the network installation. So like the layout of the assets that like I showed in that slide with the 3 buildings. So it's more of an engineering works thing, a design. And cooling as a service is just to do with those contracts and those business models to sell cooling. So that's the main difference that I wanted to point out.
Yeah, makes sense. Just one more from me. One of the things that we've been looking at a bit is the fact that humidity actually is quite a big problem in driving energy demand, insofar as if it's very, very humid, then it's much harder for the human body to cool down. And so obviously that varies. Is that something that you think, did that come into any of the conversations, or was it more just sort of temperature driven, I guess? Is that something that there was any distinction made, or at the moment,
So
is it?
what did you say about sub-Saharan climate?
So
I missed that.
So the problem of humidity, I guess, is temperatures increase, maybe everything's going to get more moist. It's everywhere's going to end up like Singapore, perhaps. Do you think that there's any differences between the humidity and just the raw heat, if you like?
Yes, absolutely. The humidity does have a huge influence on thermal comfort. So, and
are there
also,
things you can do, I guess, to?
Yeah. And it'll also have influence on the technology choice. So, for example, evaporative cooling, using evaporation of water and that will absorb through latent heat, the heat in the air. That is not efficient if it's already humid outside. So then you'd have to go for a different technology. So yes, absolutely, humidity is a big one. It's not only temperatures. Yeah.
Cool. We got a question here from Hannah Bloomfield. Do you have a sense of how choices of climate change projection, e.g. RCP26/8.5, may impact the demand for air conditioning?
Yes, so there is those projections I presented at the beginning, but there's little literature on the 1.5 and 2.0 degree scenarios. Usually cooling degree days are used as the effect of climate change, like quantify the climate change effect on cooling demand. So those are the metrics that are usually reported. But generally it's historical. We found that there's less literature around projections, something that we are also looking into. We've got climate models here, modelers in Oxford, and we're actually looking at that. So yeah, great. Yeah, you found the gap right away, Hannah. Thanks.
In terms of the, so we've got a question here from Ekaterina Fedotova. Nicole, many thanks for the great presentation. Have you noticed any shifts in cooling demand patterns or cooling related social interactions due to the pandemic?
That's an interesting one. So there has been work around cooling and the pandemic in terms of hospitals having to turn off their air conditioners because it was circulating more of the disease. But there's been other literature also saying that the filter, so the air handling units of air conditioners, actually are really good in filtering out pathogens. So there is contrasting literature out there directly related to the spread of this. In terms of energy use, I haven't. I can't think of something that we've observed, but it's something that we were keen to interview because energy demand has fallen. It has been a bit of a breath for the whole planet. Greenhouse gas emissions have fallen during the pandemic, and I would say that because air conditioners and heating, it's usually reported together, so it's hard to put apart, are responsible for 30% take or leave of greenhouse gas emissions, like building do that. So I would assume that there has been a drop in cooling demand due to the pandemic as well. I would have to look into the literature more with that more specific question, but thanks, Ekaterina.
Cool. Well, we got a couple more minutes. Just another one for me. I was curious. So this framework seems very comprehensive. I was interested I guess it depends on the context. What is the most important thing, perhaps? I mean, you sort of brought up the social interactions in this settlement that you presented. Do you get a sense that in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, how does each one change depending on where you are, I guess, in terms of which one is most important?
Of the intervention points?
Of these, yeah, sorry.
I'll put
yeah, these ones, yeah.
So which one's more important? I think that's the next step. So we've dived into those 4 examples that we think these are good interventions. We need to look at them, but it's a whole view approach. So we can't leave certain parts behind, because for example, if we were just talking about this the other day with the team, resources. What about if there's a really strong social movement against the harvest of a metal that is used in air conditioners, right? So we can't leave it out at this point, because it's a dynamic system, right? So it is really covering everything. But what we've identified is the things that we have visibility of at the moment. And so if we have to start with something, I'd say those 4 intervention points, and considering those 3 overarching themes are a good starting point. Absolutely. Yeah. And this framework would allow for those flexibilities that we need to encounter. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, we're just about coming up to 12. So just before we thank Nicole for a super interesting talk. So next, in 2 weeks' time, we've got Robbie Morrison of the Open Energy Modeling community. He's going to be talking to us on open energy system models, overview, community legal context, and emerging infrastructure. And he's worked in energy for a couple of decades now, so he's super knowledgeable. So do join that. And with that, we'll give a big thanks to Nicole, and hopefully see you all again soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole. That was really interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.